The evening rain was relentless, drumming against my office windows as I went through the acquisition papers one last time. Tomorrow, at 9 a.m. sharp, it would all be official. Morrison Holdings would be mine. 18 years of my life, all the planning, the networking, the sheer, burning ambition, it had all led to this. My father's company. The very empire he'd built while, in my eyes, systematically eroding my self-worth, was about to be under my control. Hours away, to be precise. A soft knock at the door, and my assistant, Sarah, peeked in. "Miss Hayes, your car is waiting downstairs." "Thank you, Sarah," I replied, collecting the leather portfolio that held tomorrow's presentation. It wasn't lost on me, the profound irony, that I was heading to a family dinner where my parents planned to plead for my expertise, completely oblivious that I'd already secured controlling interest in their failing business. The drive to my childhood home in Greenwich, Connecticut, typically took 40 minutes. Each mile brought back memories I'd spent nearly 2 decades trying to bury. The tree-lined streets looked exactly as they had the day my father told me to leave, declaring I'd never amount to anything without the Morrison name backing me. My mother answered the door, her smile tight. "Eleanor, darling, we're so glad you could make it." "Hello, Mother." I gave her a quick kiss on the cheek, noting the worry lines that hadn't been there before. Financial stress, I knew, had aged her considerably. My sister, Julia, sat in the living room, her designer dress doing little to hide her obvious anxiety. She'd been handed the keys to Morrison Holdings 5 years ago, after my father's first health scare forced him into semi-retirement. Back then, the company was thriving, pulling in over $200 million in annual revenue, with expansion plans across 3 states. "Eleanor." Julia's greeting held no warmth. We hadn't exchanged more than polite phrases in over a decade. "Julia, you look well." The lie felt easy on my tongue. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes betraying sleepless nights spent trying to fix the mess she'd created with her poor leadership. My father emerged from his study, moving slower than I remembered. Age and stress had diminished the imposing figure who could once make me feel completely worthless with a single look. "You came. You invited me," I countered, accepting a glass of wine from my mother and settling into the armchair I'd avoided for 18 years. Dinner was excruciating. My mother tried to make cheerful conversation about anything neutral, while a palpable tension crackled through the dining room. Finally, as dessert plates were cleared, my father cleared his throat. "I suppose you're wondering why we asked you here." "I assumed it wasn't purely social," I said, keeping my tone neutral, professional. Julia shifted uncomfortably. My father's jaw tightened before he continued. "Morrison Holdings is facing some challenges. Nothing we can't overcome, but we need someone with your particular expertise in corporate restructuring." I had built my reputation on turning around failing companies. My consulting firm, Eighte Strategic Partners, had successfully restructured 17 businesses in the last decade. The sheer irony that my father now needed those skills wasn't lost on anyone at that table. What kind of challenges? I already knew every detail. I'd paid a considerable amount for inside information about every misstep Julia had made: 3 failed acquisitions, a disastrous $40 million product launch, partnership agreements signed without proper legal review. The list went on. Some unfortunate decisions were made, my father offered, unable to bring himself to directly criticize Julia. Nothing malicious, just inexperience in certain areas. Julia's face flushed. The market shifted unexpectedly. No one could have predicted. The market shifted because you ignored every economic indicator available. I cut through her excuses cleanly. You expanded into commercial real estate at the peak of an obvious bubble. You alienated 3 of your largest clients by implementing untested software systems without proper training. And you hired your college roommate as CFO despite her having 0 relevant experience. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother's wineglass paused halfway to her lips. My father stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. "How do you know all that?" Julia's voice trembled slightly. I make it my business to know things. I set down my fork, meeting my father's gaze directly. The question isn't what I know. The question is what you're actually asking me. My father leaned back in his chair. We need your help saving the company. You're the best at what you do, and despite our history, this is still a family business. The word family nearly made me laugh. This family had cast me out at 22 because I'd refused to marry Daniel Sterling, the son of my father's business partner. I'd wanted to pursue my MBA instead of becoming a trophy wife for a man I barely knew. That decision had cost me everything, my trust fund, my connections, even my relationship with my younger brother, Eighte, who'd been forbidden from contacting me. I remembered the afternoon everything fell apart with crystal clarity. It was a Saturday in late September, unseasonably warm for Boston. My father had arranged a lunch meeting at his club, insisting I attend. Daniel was there, along with both our fathers, discussing wedding dates and merger details as if I'd already agreed to everything. When I finally interrupted their planning to announce I'd been accepted to Georgetown University's MBA program and intended to enroll, the temperature in the room dropped 30 degrees. Daniel looked personally affronted, as though my educational ambitions were a deliberate insult to his marriage proposal. His father excused himself immediately, clearly uncomfortable with the conflict brewing. My father's response started quietly, which somehow made it worse. You're throwing away a guaranteed future for what? 2 more years of school? You already have your bachelor's degree. That's more education than most women need. Most women aren't interested in running a Fortune 500 company someday, I'd replied, trying to keep my voice steady. You're not running this company. That's not how this works. His tone shifted from disappointed to angry. I've built something here, Eleanor. Daniel's father and I have been planning this merger for 3 years. You marrying Daniel solidifies everything. Our families, our businesses, our legacy. Your legacy, not mine. The argument escalated from there. Daniel initially tried playing peacemaker, suggesting we could delay the wedding until after my MBA, but my father instantly shut that down, sensing my resistance ran deeper than just timing. If you walk away from this engagement, you walk away from everything, he'd said finally. No trust fund, no company position, no family support. You'll be making your own way in the world, and we both know how that will end. I called his bluff, believing he'd relent once he realized I was serious. Instead, he had my belongings packed and delivered to a storage unit within 48 hours. My credit cards were cancelled. My apartment, which he'd been paying for, was no longer available. Even my car, a graduation gift, was repossessed since the title remained in his name. I was 22 years old with $11,000 in my personal savings, no job, and suddenly no family. I crashed on my friend Chloe's couch for 6 weeks, working temp jobs and applying to graduate programs with financial aid packages. Georgetown came through with a partial scholarship and student loans that would take me 8 years to repay. Those first months were brutal in ways I'd never discussed with anyone. I'd been raised with every advantage money could provide. And suddenly, I was checking price tags at the grocery store, walking 40 blocks to save subway fare, wearing the same 3 professional outfits in rotation because I couldn't afford more. But something unexpected happened during that struggle. Each small victory, landing a better temp position, acing a graduate school exam, successfully negotiating my first consulting contract, built a foundation of confidence that had nothing to do with my family name. I wasn't succeeding because I was a Morrison. I was succeeding because I was capable, hardworking, and smarter than most people in the room. My father had meant his ultimatum as a threat, assuming I'd come crawling back within months. Instead, he'd accidentally given me the greatest gift possible, the opportunity to discover who I was without the Morrison legacy hovering over everything. What exactly are you offering? I asked, pulling myself back to the present. A consulting position, generous compensation, naturally. Full access to all company records and decision-making processes. Under whose authority would I report? Julia? My sister's expression could have curdled milk. My father hesitated before answering. You'd report directly to me. Julia would maintain her CEO position, but you'd have veto power over major decisions until the company stabilizes. It was more than I'd expected him to offer, and simultaneously, far less than I deserved. The old me, the girl who desperately craved her father's approval, might have jumped at the opportunity. That girl was long gone. I'll need to review the financials before making any commitments. I pulled out my phone, making a show of checking my calendar. I can meet with your accounting team next week. Actually, we were hoping for something more immediate. My father's desperation was showing through the cracks in his authoritative facade. The board is meeting on Friday. Having you there would signal that we're taking aggressive action to correct course. Friday is 3 days away. You expect me to analyze an entire company's worth of financial data in 72 hours? You've done it before. He wasn't wrong. I'd built my reputation partly on my ability to quickly assess complex situations. Fine. Have everything sent to my office by tomorrow morning. Every document, every contract, every financial statement from the past 5 years. Relief flooded my mother's face. Julia looked like she'd swallowed something bitter. My father nodded slowly. Thank you, Eleanor. I know our relationship has been strained, but this means everything to your mother and me. I stood, gathering my purse. I haven't agreed to help yet. I've agreed to review the situation. Those are very different things. The drive back to my apartment in Back Bay, Boston, gave me time to savor the moment. They had no idea that tomorrow morning, while they were sending me files I'd already reviewed, my lawyers would be filing the final acquisition paperwork. By the time I walked into that board meeting on Friday, I wouldn't be there as a consultant. I'd be there as the new owner. My apartment overlooked Boston Common, a far cry from the cramped studio apartment I'd lived in when I first left home in Somerville. That apartment had rats and a radiator that barely worked. I'd eaten ramen for months, working 3 jobs while completing my MBA at Georgetown. My father had predicted I'd come crawling back within 6 months. Instead, I'd graduated top of my class and landed a position at McKinley Consulting. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael Lee, my lead attorney. Everything's set for tomorrow. Papers will be filed at 8:45 a.m. Congratulations. I poured myself a scotch, settling onto my balcony. Despite the chill, tomorrow would change everything. Morrison Holdings would become a subsidiary of Eighte Strategic Partners. Every employee would answer to me. Every decision would require my approval, and my father would finally understand what he'd thrown away 18 years ago. Sleep came surprisingly easy. I'd expected to lie awake, anxious or excited, but instead, I felt only calm, a deep certainty. The morning arrived with clear skies, unusually warm for November. I dressed in my favorite navy suit, the one I wore for important negotiations, and headed to the office. Michael was waiting in the conference room, surrounded by documents. Everything's been filed. Morrison Holdings is officially yours as of 9:03 this morning. The transition period begins immediately. Have they been notified? The board received official notice at 9:15. I expect your phone will start ringing shortly. Right on cue. My cell phone lit up. My father's name flashed across the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He called again immediately. Then my mother, then Julia. I silenced the phone entirely. The voicemails piled up throughout the morning. By lunch, I had 23 messages. I didn't listen to any of them. Instead, I prepared for Friday's board meeting where I would present my restructuring plan. A plan that included removing Julia from her CEO position and installing myself as chairwoman. My assistant buzzed me at 2 o'clock. Miss Hayes, there's a Mr. Morrison in the lobby demanding to see you. Security is asking whether they should remove him. Send him up. Time to face the music. My father looked like he'd aged another decade since last night. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly as he entered my office. "What have you done?" "I acquired a struggling company." "It's what I do." "You knew last night." "You already knew and you sat there letting us beg." "I let you do what you did to me 18 years ago. I let you realize what it feels like to have everything pulled out from under you by someone you should have been able to trust." He sank into the chair across from my desk. "This is about Daniel Sterling. Ancient history. You've destroyed your family's legacy over a grudge. This isn't about Daniel." I leaned forward, keeping my voice level despite the rage burning in my chest. "This is about you telling me I was worthless. You said I'd never succeed without the Morrison name. You said I was throwing away my future by choosing education over marriage. You erased me from the family like I'd never existed. You were young. You didn't understand the opportunity you were refusing. I understood perfectly. Daniel wanted a wife who would host dinner parties and produce heirs. I wanted to build something of my own. You couldn't tolerate a daughter with ambitions beyond what you planned. So, you're taking revenge by stealing the company." "I'm not stealing anything. I purchased controlling interest through legitimate channels. Morrison Holdings was on the market. You'd been quietly shopping for investors for months. I simply made the best offer." My father's expression crumbled. "What happens now?" "Now you show up to Friday's board meeting and listen to my restructuring plan. Julia will be removed from operational leadership. The company will be integrated into my portfolio. You'll retain your positions on the board and in advisory capacities only. And if we refuse? Then I exercise my majority shareholder rights and vote you out entirely. Your choice: accept reduced roles and salvage some dignity, or fight me and lose everything, including your board seats." He stood slowly, suddenly looking every one of his 68 years. "I never thought you had it in you to be this ruthless. I learned from the best." The words hung between us like a physical barrier. After he left, I allowed myself a moment of weakness. My hands trembled as I poured another scotch, despite the early hour. 18 years of anger, hurt, and determination had culminated in this moment. Yet, victory felt hollow somehow. I'd proven my point, demonstrated my worth, and secured my vengeance. But I'd also burned the last bridge to my family. Sarah knocked softly, entering with a stack of messages. "Your phone's been ringing constantly. Should I start forwarding calls to voicemail?" "Yes, except for Michael and anyone from the Morrison Holdings legal department. Those go straight through." She hesitated in the doorway. "If you don't mind me saying, you don't look like someone who just pulled off the business deal of the decade." I managed a weak smile. Winning isn't always what you expect it to be. After she left, I walked to the window overlooking Boylston Street. The city stretched endlessly in all directions. Millions of people pursuing their own ambitions and fighting their own battles. Somewhere out there were other daughters let down by their fathers, other families torn apart by pride and misunderstanding. My journey to this moment had been longer and more circuitous than anyone knew. The first 5 years after leaving home, I'd been too focused on survival to think much about vengeance. Graduate school consumed me completely. I'd thrown myself into my studies with obsessive intensity, determined to graduate top of my class, if only to prove my father wrong about my capabilities. McKinley Consulting had recruited me straight out of Georgetown. The starting salary of $90,000 seemed like a fortune after years of scraping by. I'd rented a tiny one-bedroom in Somerville and started building my professional network from absolute zero. Those early years at McKinley taught me everything about corporate restructuring. I worked 100-hour weeks, took every difficult assignment my bosses offered, and studied failing companies like medical students study diseases. What makes a business collapse? What warning signs appear first? How do you reverse a downward spiral once it's begun? The answer, I discovered, almost always came down to leadership. Bad decisions at the top cascaded down through every level of an organization. Remove the source of those bad decisions, implement sound strategy, and most companies could recover. By 27, I'd made senior consultant. By 30, I was leading my own team. At 32, I left McKinley to start Eighte Strategic Partners with 3 former colleagues. We scraped together our savings, maxed out credit cards, and rented office space in a building that should have been condemned. Our first client was a mid-size manufacturing company drowning in debt. We turned them around in 18 months. Word spread. More clients came. We hired staff, moved to better offices, built a reputation for taking on impossible cases and somehow making them work. Through all of it, I kept one ear to the ground regarding Morrison Holdings. I tracked their quarterly earnings, read industry coverage of their expansion plans, and maintained friendships with people who worked there or did business with them. I told myself it was just professional interest in a competitor. The truth was, I was waiting. I knew eventually my father would stumble. He was a decent businessman, but not an exceptional one. He'd inherited a thriving company from my grandfather and maintained it through conservative strategy and established relationships. But the business landscape was changing rapidly. Companies that didn't adapt got left behind. When he handed control to Julia 5 years ago, I'd actually felt a flicker of hope that maybe she'd surprise everyone. We'd never been close, but I didn't wish failure on her. Maybe she'd inherited grandfather's business instincts. Maybe she'd prove herself capable. Instead, she'd made every rookie mistake possible and invented a few new ones. I watched from a distance as she drove the company toward a cliff, each quarterly report worse than the last. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated. See, father, you chose wrong. Part of me just felt sad that the company grandfather built was being destroyed through incompetence and ego. 18 months ago, I'd learned through back channels that Morrison Holdings was quietly shopping for investors. The board was panicking, and my father was too proud to publicly admit the company needed saving. They were looking for someone to inject capital in exchange for minority ownership, enough to stabilize operations without surrendering control. That's when I'd started planning the acquisition in earnest. I had the capital by then. Eighte Strategic Partners had made me wealthy beyond anything I'd imagined during those ramen-eating years. But I needed more than just money. I needed leverage, inside information, and perfect timing. I spent 14 months preparing. I cultivated relationships with Morrison Holdings suppliers and learned which contracts were coming up for renewal. I befriended several board members socially, never mentioning my family connection, just casually crossing paths at industry events and building rapport. I hired private investigators to document every one of Julia's disasters in excruciating detail. Most importantly, I identified every single investor my father approached and made them better offers for their shares, not to buy Morrison Holdings outright, not yet, but to secure enough proxy votes that when the time came, I'd have the support I needed. The pieces fell into place slowly, methodically. Every step carefully planned and executed. Then, 2 months ago, I made my formal offer to acquire controlling interest through a shell corporation. Of course, my father would never have accepted if he'd known the buyer was me. The offer was generous enough that the board couldn't refuse, but structured specifically to prevent my father from maintaining operational control. By the time he realized what was happening, the contracts were already signed and filed. The only thing left was the notification, which I deliberately timed for the morning after our family dinner. My phone rang again, my brother Ethan. This time, I'd barely seen him since the disownment. He'd been 14 then, confused and caught in the middle. Our father had forbidden him from maintaining contact, threatening to cut off his college funding if he disobeyed. I answered. Ethan, live. His voice carried the same warmth I remembered. I heard what happened. Are you okay? The unexpected concern nearly undid me. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. Dad's a mess. Mom hasn't stopped crying. Julia's locked herself in her room. Guilt tried to creep in, but I shoved it aside. They'll survive. It's more than they gave me. I know what they did to you was wrong. I should have stood up for you back then. I was just a kid, but that's no excuse. You were 14. You couldn't have changed anything. Maybe not. But I could have tried. He paused. For what it's worth, I'm proud of you. You built something incredible from nothing. That takes strength most people never find. Tears pricked my eyes unexpectedly. Thank you. The board meeting is Friday at 10, right? I'm coming. You're on the board. Dad added me last year, probably hoping I'd somehow fix Julia's mistakes. I have no idea what I'm doing, but I show up and vote however he tells me to. He laughed, without humor. Until now. Anyway, Eleanor, you don't have to. Yeah, I do. I chose wrong 18 years ago. I'm choosing different this time. Friday morning arrived too quickly and not soon enough. I'd spent 3 days refining my restructuring plan, consulting with department heads I'd secretly met with over the past months, and preparing for every possible objection the board might raise. The Morrison Holdings boardroom was exactly as I remembered: mahogany table, leather chairs, oil paintings of company founders lining the walls. My grandfather stared down from the largest portrait, his expression stern and uncompromising. Funny how I'd inherited his business acumen, but not his gender, making me unacceptable in my father's eyes. The board members filtered in, some familiar from my childhood, others new additions. They eyed me with varying degrees of suspicion, curiosity, and hostility. Julia arrived last, her composure clearly forced. She dressed in her most authoritative outfit, probably hoping to maintain some illusion of power. My father called the meeting to order, his voice lacking its usual command. I'm sure you've all received notice of the recent ownership change. Eleanor Hayes, formerly Eleanor Morrison, now holds 51% of company shares. She's requested this meeting to present a restructuring proposal. I stood, connecting my laptop to the presentation system. Thank you all for coming. I know this transition has been sudden, but Morrison Holdings faces an existential crisis that requires immediate action. The next hour involved detailed financial analysis, market assessments, and strategic recommendations. I'd done my homework thoroughly. Every suggestion was backed by data, every criticism supported by documentation. The board members shifted from hostile to attentive as I systematically demonstrated exactly how dire the situation had become under Julia's leadership. The commercial real estate division has lost $73 million in the past 14 months. The software implementation crisis cost us 2 of our top 5 clients. Employee turnover has reached 42% in key departments. I let the numbers speak for themselves. Julia tried interrupting several times, but the data didn't lie. Her decisions had been catastrophic, driven by ego and inexperience rather than sound business strategy. My recommendation is a complete operational restructuring. This includes immediate leadership changes, portfolio rebalancing, and strategic divestment of underperforming assets. I pulled up the next slide. Effective immediately, I'll be assuming the role of CEO and chairwoman. Julia Morrison will transition to a special projects advisor position, allowing her to contribute without operational authority. The room erupted in objections, primarily from my father's oldest allies. I'd expected this. If anyone would like to propose an alternative candidate for CEO, I'm open to discussion. However, that person would need demonstrable experience in corporate turnarounds, strong industry relationships, and the trust of our remaining major clients. I paused, 3 of whom have already contacted me personally to express relief at the ownership change. That silenced most of the opposition. Our clients had been quietly panicking as Julia ran the company into the ground. My reputation preceded me. They knew I could fix this. Ethan spoke up from the end of the table. I moved to accept Eleanor Hayes as CEO and chairwoman of Morrison Holdings. My father's face went pale. He hadn't expected his son to break rank so publicly. Second, the voice belonged to Arthur Finch, the board member who'd served with my grandfather. He'd always been kind to me as a child. The vote was called. 8 in favor, 0 opposed. My father and Julia abstained, probably unable to bear voting either way. Motion carries. I tried to keep triumph out of my voice. Thank you for your confidence. I'll be scheduling individual meetings with each department head next week. In the meantime, all major expenditures require my written approval. Julia stormed out immediately after the meeting adjourned. My father lingered, looking lost. I'd like to schedule a one-on-one meeting with you, I told him quietly. There are operational matters we need to discuss, particularly regarding client relationships you've maintained. He nodded slowly. Tuesday work for you? Tuesday's fine. My mother appeared in the doorway as other board members filed out. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by recent events. Eleanor, could we talk privately? We moved to a smaller conference room. My mother sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. I know I can't undo what happened 18 years ago. I should have stood up for you. I should have fought harder against your father's ultimatum. Why didn't you? The question had haunted me for nearly 2 decades. Because I was a coward. Her honesty surprised me. I'd spent my entire marriage deferring to your father's judgment. When he insisted you were making a mistake, I convinced myself he knew best. By the time I realized how wrong we'd been, you were gone. And too proud to come crawling back. Would you have welcomed me if I had? I don't know. I'd like to think yes, but I've never tested my courage against your father's will. She looked up, meeting my eyes directly. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it, but I am asking if there's any possibility of rebuilding something between us. The question deserved consideration. My mother had been complicit in my exile, but she'd also been trapped in her own way, raised in an era when wives didn't challenge their husbands, taught that family unity meant accepting the patriarch's decisions without question. I don't know, I answered honestly. Right now, I'm focused on saving this company. Everything else is secondary. That's fair. She stood to leave, then paused. For what it's worth, your grandfather would be proud of you. He always said you had more business sense than anyone else in the family. Your father couldn't stand hearing it. That revelation struck deep. My grandfather had passed away when I was 19, 3 years before the final confrontation with my father. He'd been grooming me to eventually take over the company, much to my father's irritation. After his passing, my father had immediately redirected all succession planning toward Julia. The next 6 months became a blur of 18-hour days and relentless restructuring. I sold off the commercial real estate division at a significant loss, but managed to recover more than Julia's advisors had projected. The software systems were scrapped entirely, returning to our proven operational methods. I personally met with every major client, rebuilding relationships my sister had damaged. Employee morale improved almost immediately. Turnover dropped to 12% within 90 days. The company culture shifted from anxious chaos to cautious optimism. I kept Julia on payroll despite advice to terminate her entirely. She worked on minor projects, mostly research assignments that kept her busy without giving her authority to cause damage. We rarely spoke beyond necessary professional communication. My father attended every board meeting, offering input when requested, but no longer trying to control decisions. Our Tuesday meetings became regular fixtures, awkward at first, but gradually evolving into something resembling collaboration. He knew the industry intimately, and I needed that institutional knowledge to navigate certain client relationships. One evening, about 8 months after the acquisition, he lingered after our meeting. The quarterly numbers are impressive. You've accomplished more in 8 months than I managed in the last 5 years. You built something worth saving. I'm just course correcting. That's generous, considering I nearly destroyed it. He sat back down, looking tired. I owe you an apology, not just for the acquisition, for everything that came before. I'd waited 18 years to hear those words, yet now they felt anticlimactic somehow. Why did you push so hard for me to marry Daniel? Because I was terrified. The admission clearly cost him. Your grandfather favored you. Everyone could see you had the talent to run this company. But I built my entire identity around being the Morrison heir. And suddenly my daughter was going to outshine me before she even turned 30. So you tried to sideline me by marrying me off. I told myself I was protecting you from the pressures of corporate life. I convinced myself you'd be happier as Daniel's wife. But really, I was protecting my own ego. He rubbed his face wearily. Watching you rebuild this company has been humbling. You're everything I feared you'd be: brilliant, decisive, and completely capable of succeeding without me. I didn't do this to prove anything to you. I know. And somehow that makes it worse. We sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, I spoke. I can't forget what happened. The damage runs too deep. I understand. But maybe we can build something new. Not parent and child. That ship sailed years ago. But perhaps colleagues who share history. His eyes brightened slightly. I'd like that. Eighte became my unexpected ally through everything. He joined the company officially, working in business development where his natural charm proved valuable. We had lunch weekly, slowly rebuilding the sibling relationship we'd lost. He never pressured me to reconcile with our parents beyond professional necessities, understanding that some wounds needed time to heal, if they ever would. My mother and I maintained a careful distance. We were polite at family functions, cordial in professional settings, but the warmth of a mother-daughter relationship never materialized. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be fully rebuilt. Julia eventually left the company entirely, taking a generous severance package to pursue other interests. Last I heard, she'd married a cardiologist and moved to Florida. We haven't spoken since her departure. Morrison Holdings returned to profitability by the end of my first year as CEO. By year 2, we'd exceeded our previous peak revenues. I'd proven what my grandfather always believed, that I could lead the company to heights my father never imagined. But the victory felt different than I'd anticipated during those 18 years of planning and building toward this moment. Vengeance had been sweet initially, watching my father realize exactly what he'd thrown away. Yet, the sustained success that followed revealed something unexpected. I didn't need his validation anymore. I'd needed it desperately at 22 when his rejection had shattered my self-worth. I channeled that pain into ambition, driving myself relentlessly to prove him wrong. And I had proven him wrong beyond any possible doubt. But somewhere along the way, I'd stopped needing him to acknowledge it. The girl who'd left home 18 years ago had been desperate for her father's approval, willing to sacrifice her dreams if it meant belonging to the family. The woman I'd become had built her own empire, created her own legacy, and discovered that the Morrison name carried far less weight than she'd once believed. Standing in my corner office overlooking Boston, I sometimes thought about that rainy night when I'd driven to dinner with acquisition papers in my briefcase. I'd felt so powerful then, knowing I held their fate in my hands. The reality proved more complex than simple triumph. I'd won everything I'd fought for, and lost things I hadn't realized I'd wanted until they were beyond reclaiming. My relationship with my father would never be what it might have been. My mother and I would never share the closeness that could have existed. Julia and I would never be true sisters. But I'd also gained something invaluable: absolute certainty in my own capabilities. I'd proven I could build an empire from nothing, resurrect a failing company, and command respect in an industry that had once dismissed me as a disappointing daughter. The Morrison name was mine again, but on my terms this time, and that made all the difference. Last week, my father officially retired from the board. At his farewell dinner, he stood to give a speech. His voice cracked slightly as he spoke about the company's history, his own father's legacy, and the challenges of recent years. Then he looked directly at me. When Eleanor left 18 years ago, I told myself she'd failed, that she couldn't handle the pressure of our family's expectations. I was wrong about everything. He paused, emotions clearly threatening to overwhelm him. She didn't fail. I did. And somehow, despite my failure, she found the grace to save everything I nearly destroyed. This company survives because of her talent, her determination, and her willingness to look past old wounds to do what needed doing. The room applauded. I accepted the recognition with mixed feelings, pride in what I'd accomplished, sadness for what it had cost, and cautious hope that perhaps some wounds could eventually heal, even if the scars remained forever. As I drove home that night, I passed the street where I'd grown up. The house looked different, somehow, smaller and less imposing than my memory suggested. I didn't stop. Didn't feel compelled to revisit those old rooms where so much pain had originated. That part of my life was finished. I'd reclaimed what was mine, proven every doubter wrong, and built something extraordinary. From the ashes of rejection. The papers in my briefcase that rainy night 18 years ago had contained more than just acquisition documents. They contained the culmination of nearly 2 decades of hurt, anger, and relentless determination. Opening that briefcase had changed everything, not just for my family, but for me as well. I'd set out to prove I didn't need them. In the end, I'd proven I didn't need their validation either. And that was the greatest victory of all. What part of your past still drives you today?